Reactive Training Systems.
Welcome back to the RTS podcast. Today I'm going to have on a guest, Jacob Tsypkin. I've had Jacob on before. If you're interested in hearing the first episode that we recorded, that was back 2 years ago, back in February of 2016. So you can look back in our archived episodes for that one. And if you want to know more about Jacob's background and stuff like that, we definitely get into that more then. This conversation kind of starts from a jumping off point of knowing who we are and what we're about, and it's really more indicative of a conversation that Jacob and myself would have basically any other time. We definitely get into the weeds on this one from a training theory standpoint, veering off into science and epistemology and philosophy and why that matters for training. So hopefully it's something that you guys really enjoy. And I don't want to drag this intro out because the episode's already nearly 2 hours. But that's basically all I've got to say. Hope you guys enjoy.
What's really important about this idea, you often get I think a lot of time in training you get this sort of debate between bro science and quote unquote real science. And the thing that the real sciencers sort of always go back to, look at the research, here's what the research says. And I want to be clear here, I think research is super important and super valuable, but the sort of what they come back to is they rely on this particular understanding of the truth, capital T truth. And here's the thing that I think is really important to understand, that everybody has to understand. Objective reality definitely exists. Objective truth exists. And if you deny it, you're kind of being dumb. But there are limits to our ability to access objective reality, to access what is capital T truth. So there are myriad tools that maybe get us closer to truth. One of our most powerful tools by any measure is the scientific method, scientific processes. But like all of our tools, like all tools of human inquiry, science has limits. And sometimes we bump into those limits and we find that we're able to make progress while doing something that maybe seems contraindicated by the science, or just that the science hasn't been able to explain yet. So this is not to say that this means the science is wrong. That's a really narrow sort of view of how science works, and for that matter, how knowledge works. It's not that science is wrong. It's that science is a tool for inquiry, a really, really good one, arguably the best one we have, at least when it comes to assessing the natural world, the physical world. But like all other tools, it has limits, fewer limits than other tools perhaps, but it has limits. And sometimes we have to, in the real world, do things that seem, for whatever reason, intuition, a kind of, tacit understanding of the process. If you've been training for 10 years, or just things that you might understand about training that you may not be able to articulate. But at some point, in some cases, you might have to rely on that more than you rely on what the research says.
Yeah. I actually bumped into something like that literally yesterday. I was listening to a podcast, and there was a guy who was advocating for a particular style of training. And the explanation that was given was pretty, it seemed shoddy to me, it's well, yeah, you're offering this explanation, but it probably doesn't work that way. Now, that's not to say that the phenomenon that he observed is incorrect as well. It's just that the reasoning is probably not right. And in fact, if you think about it, in my case, I was able to think about it and come up with what seems to me to be a more plausible reason why he might observe what he's observed. Now that's a weird position to be in. I feel like our minds don't like that, that we want this person to either be right or wrong, and to be right, but, have wrong reasoning is difficult to kind of hold at the same time, you know? So
yeah, it's much more stressful for me to deal with cases like that. Like it's much less sort of existentially irritating when I think someone is just flat out wrong.
Yeah.
Like, whatever, you're wrong, I don't care. Whereas when people are right, when I agree with them, but they have sort of stumbled upon the truth rather than walked a clear path to it, it's frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, my tendency is to look at this reflexively as well, and it's like, you know, what things am I doing that are you know, of similar kind? You know, like the story that always comes into my mind whenever we kind of get to a topic like this is, like, I remember when I was a little kid, you know, I remember talking to my grandpa, and, you know, later on in his life, basically he smoked his whole life, you know, and later on in his life, he started to have a lot of health problems because of that, you know, heart problems and emphysema and, you know, the whole deal. And I remember, like, being, you know, a kid and sitting over at his house and saying to him, "Grandpa, why did you ever even start smoking to begin with? You know, like duh," you know? And he looked at me and he was like, "Well, you gotta think, like, back then when I started smoking, like, we didn't know it was bad for you." And man, that really hit me at the time, and it stuck with me all these years. And I thought, what am I doing? What do I believe, you know, is true currently, that's going to be shown, like, unequivocally not true in the future, you know? And I don't know, so far, if I say so myself, that kind of intellectual humility has served me well, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely things that, you know, we look at it now, and it's not even, you don't need to know anything about, you know, smoking is a great example. You don't need to know anything about smoking. You can just kind of look at it and sort of intuit that seems bad. You're inhaling smoke. Everything about that seems bad. Without really even knowing the details. Like, in fact, I don't know the specific mechanisms by which smoking is bad for you. I don't know anything about that. But it's very easy. Just, you see somebody smoking a cigarette and you kind of have this intuitive, like, that seems like it's not good for you. And it's totally possible that, you know, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, whatever, whenever your grandpa started smoking, that just wasn't a intuition that people had. A lot of the intuitions that we have are culturally informed. You know, and culture, thankfully, is often informed by science, mostly for the better. And we sort of have this, you know, scientific intuition that smoking is bad, but it's totally possible that your grandfather simply did not have that intuition and nobody else around him did. And it's perfectly reasonable to expect that, you know, 60 years from now, somebody will look at things that we thought were commonplace, and they'll look at it and they'll have the exact same reaction you did. Duh. Why did you do that? Right? But it's just, it's not obvious. And sometimes things that seem obvious only become obvious after they're made explicit in some way that sort of bleeds down into the public consciousness, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, we definitely got off to talking about something other than transference and specificity, which is totally fine. I think this is definitely
well. Since we're going to defend the claim that transference is more important than specificity, I think the fact that we were not specifically on topic is very appropriate.
Well, I thought that, so let me back up for a second. Yeah. So I suppose we should back up and kind of give the genesis of this little talk. I made a post a while back talking about transference being more important than specificity, that especially in powerlifting, we kind of have a fetish with specificity and specific training. And that's kind of gone a little bit more out of fashion in, I would say, the last couple of years. But it's still there in a lot of circles. And yeah, and the thing is...
Yeah, and it comes in and out.
I think that people have a pretty unsophisticated view of what specificity is to begin with. But then the thing that we care about my claim was that the thing that we care about more than specificity is transfer. What we're really trying to do is improve your sport result. And if we take powerlifting as an example, you want the training that you do to make you better at your sport. That's transfer. So do we really care if it's specific training that you're doing, if it doesn't make you better at your sport? Well, not really. The ultimate thing that you're after is transfer. And I think kind of the implied claim on the other side is that highly specific training is going to get you a better transfer. Okay, let me just kind of stop there for a second. What I wanted to start us out with is maybe what an operational definition of specificity would be. If you have one, feel free to jump in. If not, I've got one.
I'd like to hear yours. I don't know if I've ever thought specifically about a definition for specificity. So what do you got?
Well, so in the past, I've used Bondarchuk's criteria for dynamic correspondence, but it's almost like speaking a different language. so I've recently kind of put that one on pause a little bit, and I found one that I like better. It's Frans Bashas' definition. I tend to like that a bit better. So he's got 5 criteria. We're talking about the inner structure of the movement. So inner structure would be things like inter and intramuscular coordination, things like that. The second criteria is outer structure of the movement. So things like, if we're talking about, this would be like where you've placed your hands on the barbell or your stance or things like that. So things that are kind of outside of the internal body mechanism. Third criteria is energy production, and then sensory perception, and then the last criteria is intention. So I feel like that's a pretty good definition, although I've become a lot more interested in what Bosch has to say lately. And in some interviews where he's talking about this, he talks about, he feels like that's his operating definition for specificity, but he feels like even that is pretty vague and unsophisticated.
Yeah, that seems to me a lot more like a conceptual definition, and not necessarily a bad one. When I think of an operational definition, I think of something that's much more, I guess, applicable in the actual work day to day. I feel like that, like this sort of long list set of criteria, is something that's much more like abstract, which is not a bad thing. I think it's good to have an abstract definition and have an operational definition based on that, but that doesn't feel particularly operational to me. I mean,
fair enough. So I mean, that's my words. So I'll have to take the hit for that. But the way that I would use that in kind of a training setting is I would look at a movement, and if you're gonna do something like vary the tempo of the movement, that is a change to the movement, so it's a little bit further removed from, the competition exercise. So it's a little bit less specific, it's like high specificity is the bullseye of the target, and the more things you change, it's like the further you go out from that bullseye.
Sure. Yeah. That leaves us with a really big challenge of I think that specificity is very easy to identify in powerlifting, right? Whatever you feel intuitively is quote unquote specific, you're probably right. If it looks like a squat, it's probably specific. When we start delving off into sports that are not nearly so clear cut, right? So for example, my work is with competitive CrossFit athletes. What specificity look like there? Oh man, when I have a good, clean and immutable response to that question, I'll let you know. But that's not even the most complicated, because at least with CrossFit, we can still kind of identify, we know we're going to do X, Y, and Z. What is specificity in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? What is specificity in football? I think these sports have much more gray area, right? Because I can really reasonably say, look, for powerlifting, the only things that are 100% specific are 1 rep max squat, 1 rep max bench press, 1 rep max deadlift. And I can even go so far as to say, well, it's not truly 100% specific without the sort of emotional amplitude of competition day and the crowd and having to deal with the warm-up area and all that. But, we won't get off in the weeds there. Let's just say I could reasonably make a case that nothing but top singles in the squat, bench press, and deadlift is truly specific for powerlifting. If that's the case, what's truly specific for jiu-jitsu, where every single instance of training is in some way different from every other single instance of training? I could roll with the same person twice in a row with 1 minute break in between, and the experience, it's certainly more similar than it is different, but it will be different in more ways, in far more ways than two heavy singles in the squat will be different from each other.
Well, that's one of the interesting things. I'm starting to get the feeling that I'm going to be bringing up Bosch quite a lot during this conversation, which by the way, I'll just throw out there right now that I feel like I have a highly underdeveloped understanding of what he's got to say. So there's a good chance that I'm going to mischaracterize some of his points. So I'll just go ahead and throw that out there right now. But I think those are really, combat sports in particular pose a challenge because immediately you're dealing with a problem that is learning and evolving as you are learning and evolving, and you've got part of the challenge is to learn faster than your opponent is learning, to get inside of their learning process so that you're doing things that they can't anticipate and counter, right?
And very, very dynamic problem solving.
Yeah, exactly. Now, one of the things that I did pick up from just kind of my preliminary investigations into some of what Bosch has to say is that something like football or rugby or anything like that, those are going to be open skill sports. There will still be closed skill components to those sports, but they're not, and obviously not entirely closed skill. But something like powerlifting or sprinting or pole vaulting or whatever is those are closed skill sports that it's something that you're trying to do more or less the same way every time. And then there's some things that seem to be somewhat in between, like batting in baseball, or something like that. Right. So there are closed skill components that are beneficial to improve. And honestly, I think that's where kind of strength and conditioning coaches fall most often. It's like, well, you need to improve the closed skill portions of this. But I think where we fall short a lot of times is kind of misunderstanding the amount of difficulty that's present in the sport task itself, and I think you see this with some agility drills, like you see coaches having athletes do like the agility ladders and stuff like that. And I know that a lot of people, kind of laugh at that, and I'm probably more on that side than the other side. But I think one of the problems with things like agility ladders is that it's making the problem too easy to solve. It's not the same skill as what's going on in the field. And, essentially it's like, well, it's just too easy, and if you can make it more challenging, then you're probably going to have more transfer. It's like you're going too far away from specificity in that case,
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting because so one way to think about strength and conditioning in this context, and what is the role of strength and conditioning, is that particularly for open skill sports, I think that's how you characterize them. Yeah. Is that the job of strength and conditioning at that point? I don't even know if it's really to develop the closed skill parts of the sport, so to speak, but maybe it's something more like open skill sports are really, really hard to pin down. You don't really know what's going to happen, but we have good reasons to believe that improving certain fitness characteristics for any particular sport will improve the athlete's ability to handle those open skill situations. So if you're training a football player, you may not know the exact scenario of every play of a game, but given the player's position, you can have a pretty reasonable understanding of well, look, if he improves his 40-yard time, if he improves his vertical jump, if he brings up his 5-rep max back squat. Those are all decent proxies for improving the fitness characteristics necessary to make him better at handling those open skill elements. And I think that's an important thing to remember if we're, as long as we're getting off into the philosophical weeds here, every time we improve some metric that we are using to measure progress, with the exception of really closed skill sports such as powerlifting, what we're actually doing is using a proxy. So even for like CrossFit, where strength is important, and your 1-rep maxes might be important in and of themselves in a certain competition, maybe, but more often than not, your 1-rep max back squat serves as a proxy. What I mean by that is that your 1-rep max back squat, if it goes up, gives us good reason to believe, okay, your legs and back are significantly stronger. And we further have reason to believe that your legs and back getting stronger has positive carryover to other things we do in the sport. So this is 1-rep max back squat, or maybe you prefer 3-rep or 5-rep, whatever, is a good proxy for improving your sport-specific fitness. And I think it's really important to understand, there's two things to glean here. One, most of the time we are dealing with proxies. Powerlifting and even weightlifting is really full of proxies, right? Because weightlifters have to squat a ton, but improving your squat strength is a proxy for improving your leg strength in a way that is directly applicable to the snatch and clean and jerk. And this kind of comes back around to what we were talking about. When you look at things in this light, you begin to understand really easily, oh, I care about transference, and specificity is incidental. So what I mean by that is, if I could give you clear and irrefutable evidence right now that the best way to develop the back squat in a way that is conducive to competition and powerlifting, that is, let's assume it's like a lowish bar back squat, is not to train the squat, but to train the leg press and good mornings. If I could give you evidence for that was really clear and repeatable, that's what you would have your athletes do. Because what you care about is their squat going up in competition. You care about the transference from training to the competitive event. And the fact that specific exercises happen to have a very high transference most of the time, that's purely incidental. It just so happens that squatting makes you better at squatting. We squat because it makes you better at squatting, not because it's specific to squatting.
Now I think we're really getting into it. So yes, exactly. And I wanted to make sure that we weren't making a straw man of this, that people that advocate for ultra high specificity training in something like shot put or powerlifting or whatever, they wouldn't disagree. Up to this point, they would say, yes, but, it's the high specificity training that has the best transfer. Now, that's, I think, where, at least for me personally, I start to diverge a little bit. I do think that on the whole, high specificity training is going to have a better transfer than low specificity training. So what I mean by that is, if we had, let's say, 2 cohorts of 100 powerlifters each, and on one cohort, we're going to have them do highly specific training. The other cohort, we're going to have them do a bunch of assistance work. Which one's going to have the best progress at the end of the training program? On the average, I do think that it's going to be the high specificity training group, but that's because the assistance group, you can't take these individual differences into account, right? The question that we're faced with as coaches and as athletes or self-coached athletes or whatever is not what's better for people in general. It's what's better for this athlete in particular, and if you have an athlete in particular and you can give them some sort of prescriptive exercise intervention and that leads to better transfer, then that's the thing that you care about. And
Sure.
Now I'm kind of getting further away from, I suppose, the solid footing. And I would just say that in my experience, there are things that do transfer well. They just vary quite a lot from lifter to lifter. And I think as a coach, it's your job to figure out what those things are and include those in the training program. And that's not easy to do. And it seems like people will talk about, customized training programs. And at least, especially since kind of the boom of online coaching, of which I've been a part, customized training has been, kind of held up as the standard almost. But I've seldom run into a coach that has a process for customizing the training. It's just kind of, hey, it's customized training. Well, how does that happen? Well, it just kind of happens, and there's kind of some hand waving that goes on, and, training comes in, it goes into a magic box, boom, out comes customized training. I don't know. I think that if we look at it as charitably as possible, at best, you're talking about just relying on the coach's ability to recognize patterns. But even that, I think, I don't think that you have to look at it that charitably all the time.
Sure.
Certainly some people are falling into that category, and then others maybe not.
Sure. Yeah. So there's a few things here. I don't want to, so like regarding that sort of last point, I don't want to write off the value of sort of coach's intuition, so to speak, right? I mean,
oh, for sure.
Yeah. There's definitely an element, and I do this all the time. I write my programming for my athletes in a very bottoms up way. Typically, I only write 1 week of programming at a time. We always have like a general structure, but it might, week to week, it's really like fill out your training log, and we will take a look at your training, and I will make some decisions about the next week's training. Now that doesn't mean it's like, just off in the weeds kind of, oh, well, we're on this progression of 5s, but my intuition says we should do heavy singles this week. It's not like that. But I think that we do have to sort of pay due deference to the fact that intuition plays a role, even for the people who are the most organized, which is certainly not me. But I know that, you are probably the most, with this stuff, the most organized coach I know. And I know that there's still an element of intuition. And, you've kind of, the way that I've heard you categorize this before is sort of like, look, I can't tell you why I had you do sets of 6s instead of sets of 5. Fortunately, it also probably doesn't matter. But maybe something just nudged you, whatever. You just felt like 6 is the right number here. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong or bad in any way.
I totally agree, by the way. I think, and I would, tell me if you agree with this too. I often will go a step further and rely on athlete intuition as well. Like, I like getting feedback from an athlete that says, like, I don't really know if there's anything to this, but I just kind of feel like doing some heavy triples is going to be beneficial to me. If I don't have a good reason to deny that, then I think that's a useful place to look. The way I kind of think of it is, if you ever, you spend a lot of time outside, you're working or training or whatever, you spend a lot of time sweating, and then like later on, you've got a really intense craving for something salty. It feels something like that. Like maybe there's a reason that you're craving doing triples. Or maybe not. But we have to look, or else we'll never know. And I think that's as valid place to look as any.
Right. There's actually, so on that same point, there's I know you listen to the podcast with John Danaher, but probably a lot of your listeners, if they're not associated with jiu-jitsu or have me breathing down their necks telling them to listen to it, probably don't know who he is. So John Danaher is a Brazilian jiu-jitsu coach out of Renzo Gracie's academy in New York. Arguably one of the most successful coaches in the relatively young sport of jiu-jitsu, and a very, very interesting guy. Danaher, when he became a full-time coach, in order to do so, he dropped out of his PhD program at Columbia in philosophy. So obviously a nerd after my own heart, and has a really interesting way of looking at all these things. If anybody's interested in these kind of topics in general, I highly recommend listening to the episode of the Joe Rogan podcast he did. I can't stand Joe Rogan, but I've never heard so little of him, so I promise it's tolerable. But there's a different interview with Danaher. I want to say it's from like a BJJ Hacks video where he says something along these lines. He says that with regards to sort of the input that athletes have in their own, programming is maybe not the right word in jiu-jitsu, just be training or their own game or whatever. He says something along the lines of, at the level of fundamentals, I'm a dictator. There are certain sort of basic elements of jiu-jitsu that everyone, no matter their height, their weight, their age, their preferences, must be able to execute consistently, successfully, and technically. Once you're past that sort of level of fundamentals, Danaher says, okay, so at that point, I don't remember the exact words he used, but it's something like, at this point, I'm a consultant. If you're a high-level grappler, or even just moderately high level, you sort of, by having mastered these fundamentals, you have a sufficient understanding of the principles of grappling that you can let your game and the way that you do jiu-jitsu be dictated to some extent by body type, personality, preference, whatever. And I think this kind of mirrors the way that I look at this, which is that we can look at it in terms of a particular movement, right? So let's say the squat. There are certain more or less immutable rules of good squatting. You have to have your weight evenly balanced across your foot. You have to keep good posture. Now, good posture is going to be somewhat relative, dependent on, like, are you squatting low bar, are you squatting high bar, what is your build like, etc. But you have to be relatively upright. You have to keep your back relatively straight, etc. So there are these kind of basic rules that are just fundamental mechanical rules of the squat that everyone must abide by, right? Okay, we have that down. So now we can say, well, if an athlete tells me they just feel better with their stance a little wider or narrower, or with their toes turned out or in a little more, I'm not even going to say I don't have a good reason to deny that. I'm actually going to say, I'm going to ask the question, what would a good reason to deny that even look like? An athlete who knows how to squat, who has a mechanically sound, safe squat, who's been training for, let's say, a year, whatever, tells me, hey, coach, when I turn my feet out a little more, it just feels better. I don't really know what I mean by better exactly. It just feels more comfortable. What would a reason that is sufficient for me to deny that even look like? I can't conceptualize it. An athlete tells me this feels better. What is a response which justifies my denying them? Can you think of one?
I mean, the only thing that I could think of is if performance was dramatically better with a different stance. But I mean, that's
even that I'm not sure of, because it might just be the case that, well, maybe if we try this stance for 3 weeks, performance will catch right back up and the athlete will feel better, right? So sure, maybe there can be good reasons to say after experimenting, this is clearly negatively impacting your performance. But if the athlete just says, hey, I've been playing with squatting like this and like it feels way better, I can't even conceptualize, again, outside of the realm of a totally insane, like, hey, Mike, this feels better, but my sets of 5 are down 20%. Outside of something extreme like that, I don't even think there's a way for me to conceptualize a good reason to tell the athlete, no, that's wrong.
For things like that, yeah, I totally agree. So again, something that I've picked up from my preliminary readings of Bosch, he talks about attractors and fluctuators. So an attractor are those aspects of the technical execution that are essential. I think, I think I'm getting this more or less right, and fluctuators are those aspects that can change and should change depending on differences in the scenario and the differences in the challenge that's presented to the athlete. One of the ways that he recommends looking for attractors are times where the athlete is under a significant time pressure. So they have to basically just react. There's not time to think your way out of the situation, So time pressure would be one time to look at attractors. Another time would be if there's an incidence of common injury. So one thing that I thought of would be like a back injury. In powerlifting, back injuries tend to be, probably one of the more common injuries that we see. So if you have somebody that is rounding their back, that's probably, you should probably have an attractor there. That's running your back is probably one of those things that you shouldn't negotiate on. Now, other things like what you're talking about, like your toe angle, and if you want to squat high bar or low bar, things like that, those are going to be more in the fluctuator category, And to go further, I don't know if this adds to the conversation at all, but his claim is that these attractors tend to be common across sports and across human movement, more or less. Now, I don't know enough about it to go any further down that rabbit hole, but I just thought that was kind of an interesting observation.
That seems pretty reasonable. I mean, you, at least with certain things, right? I mean, everybody's heard the phrase athletic stance, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of reasonable, right? Whether you're playing football or soccer or rugby, or even to some extent jiu-jitsu or boxing or whatever, there are sort of like certain elements of posture that you take in order to be quote unquote more athletic, right? You are kind of like balanced on the midfoot. You're kind of bouncy and springy, so you can move around quickly. You've got your weight balanced in a particular way. So I don't think that's unreasonable. But yeah, and I think it is exactly that. And I think that this sort of idea of like strict fundamentals, which are the foundation for a little bit more flexible, advanced elements, might even carry over to programming. If I have an athlete who's been training for 2 or 3 or 5 years, and so first of all, it's not only perfectly possible that they may have noticed patterns in their own training which I have not noticed. I actually think it is not only possible, I think it is desirable and likely. If you and I have talked about this a good bit, which is that like we are believers in coaching towards autonomy, which is not to say like I want to coach an athlete to the point where they no longer need me, but rather I want to coach an athlete in such a way that we are mutually involved in the process. And I think if you do that successfully, it's inevitable and probably a good thing when an athlete notices patterns that the coach is incapable by necessity of noticing, because the coach does not have the athlete's experience of their own training. So when an athlete who's been working with me for a certain amount of time, who I know is experienced, whose judgment I trust, says, I feel like I'm better off. So a great example would be like, maybe I have an athlete squatting sets of 5 for a total of 30 reps, 6 sets of 5. Maybe they say, I feel better if I do the same weight and just keep all the reps faster. So maybe I do 10 sets of 3 instead. I don't really have any good reason to say no. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've thought about this before, and that maybe goes back to the thing I was saying about, those intuitive moments that, an athlete has an intuition about what's going to work best for them. If they, maybe it's something like that. Let's take your example. And the way I would characterize that in my own vernacular is to say like lower RPE sets, so equivalent volume, lower RPE sets. Unless I can look back and see like, oh, hey, well, actually we've tried this before. We've tried this a number of times and it's never worked. I'm going to at least give it a shake, because another thing too is that we've got to realize that the athlete that we're working with in this training block is different from the athlete that we've worked with in past training blocks. They share, yeah. I mean, there's a huge similarity, right? But there are some very key differences too. Like if your training is actually doing anything, then the athlete will be different. And even if it's not doing the thing that you want it to do, the athlete will be different because they're older and they have.
Because time is linear.
Exactly. Right.
Right. This is something that we've kind of talked about before. You've talked a bit about sort of emergence in training. I've written about this, and this is a big part of the reason that I think so. Like RPE style training is much, 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 much better than just using percentages, because I mentioned earlier that everything we do in training, or most of what we do in training, is a proxy. Percentages are, when I write a training program, when an athlete reads back squat 5 sets of 5 with 80%, that whole thing is a proxy for a training effect. Every program, all that your program is a proxy for a training effect, right? I could instead of writing squat 5x5 at 80%, I could write perform a movement that's, hip and knee flexion, then hip and knee extension, while isometrically stabilizing your midline or your core or whatever. Use a rep range and weight that are submaximal but high force production, and you're going to you want something that gives you some hypertrophy adaptation, and make sure all your sets are submaximal. I just told you the same thing, right? Like that's it, but it's just a super convoluted way of saying it that would any reasonable person would look at this and go, seems to me there are probably more efficient ways of communicating this, and that's what language will. But all that a program is, when you read a program, is a codification of desired training effects. That's what it is. So when you look at something like using percentages, why would I want to say, all right, well, I'm going to use 80% of a 1-rep max that the athlete set 16 weeks ago, 12 weeks ago, or whatever. Why would I do that? Time is linear. So the degree to which that athlete, the degree to which that 1-rep max is relevant to the athlete's current fitness or state becomes more and more and more and more and more useless the further in time we get away from that point. When I have a fantastic tool at my fingertips to get exact feedback on exactly how the athlete is performing during this exact training session. Why would I not use that?
Yeah. Honestly, the only thing that the major drawbacks to RPE training all come back to the accuracy with which the athlete can judge it. How accurately can they determine what their RPE is?
Yeah, maybe so, but that's like saying the major drawbacks to squatting come back to the athlete's ability to squat correctly. Squatting correctly is a developed skill. So is precisely measuring your RPE, right? So yeah.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think there's some ways that technology can help us be a bit more accurate with it. Video review or velocity or whatever. But essentially, it's all kind of getting back at the same thing, and it goes back to your point about the training program being an attempt to prescribe certain training effects. We're trying to do this thing. Well, why? Because there's a result that we want to get from it.
Right.
And it's that result that you're after. Now, what you have is, I don't think it's not even just like, bad coaches can't figure out what training effect that they want. I would even say that most of us, and I would put myself in this category, probably can't articulate the exact training effect that we're trying to get from a certain intervention. You can, to a degree, or some protocols you can be more clear with than others, but that's the thing that you're after. There's the training effect that you're after, and that's what you're trying to get out of it. And having any sort of auto-regulated measure, is just an attempt to get that training effect more precisely. Like we can talk about RPE, but I've kind of got away from using it more recently, but let's talk about like fatigue percents, something that is an attempt to auto-regulate the volume of work that you're doing. That's an attempt at the same thing. And, it's a different conversation as far as like how effective is this tool in what it's trying to do, but that's what it's trying to do, is to tailor the training to get a more precise effect.
Right. Yeah. That's sort of like, I'm not sure if this is sort of the route you're going down, but that is fundamentally the entire process of what quote unquote customization of programming is, right? We have general principles of training. They exist and they are reliable, but they are descriptive. That is to say, general principles of training are derived from observation about averages. Our job as coaches is to take those general principles, apply them prescriptively, and over time sort of whittle away at the stuff that works and doesn't work for a particular athlete. That's what customizing a program is. It's all about eliciting a training effect. We take these general principles, which again are descriptive, right? The way that they're derived is descriptive. You don't really find general principles you find general principles by observing. I mean, you posted the other day about Prilepin's chart, which I agree is of very limited applicability. But what's really interesting is looking at how Prilepin's chart was created. Well, did Prilepin perform a bunch of experiments and test groups and come to these conclusions? No, Prilepin tracked the training of a bunch of Master of Sport and Master of Sport International class weightlifters. He tracked what they were already doing and came to conclusions about what kind of averaging out he should do, and built this chart. That is how most of the information we come upon in sort of exercise science is derived. Even when you actually do perform a study, the study is informed by some sort of intuition of real world training. I hate the way that sounds, real world, because it sounds like I'm sort of being, like I'm denigrating the scientific process. I'm not by any means, but we have to keep in mind that the results we come out of are descriptive. They're telling us what happened in a particular study or in this particular, meta-analysis or whatever. And it's just not the case that you can sort of blindly apply general principles. General principles are descriptive. We then take an athlete and say, well, here are the general principles. In what ways do we need to modify them in order to get the program this athlete needs? And I think it's worth noting, at least for me, when I start working with an athlete at first, the program is more general. The reason being, I don't think that when I'm working with an athlete for the first time, I can't just look at their numbers and their training history and say, oh, I know everything exactly as you need it. That would be the height of arrogance. Right. So when I start with an athlete, the program looks more like general principles. And over time, as I said, we whittle away and find what works for the athlete. And it is, of course, the case that most of the time, the things that work do seem to fit in some way or another with general principles of training. But that is, again, a descriptive claim, not a prescriptive claim. It just so in the same way that we were talking about, what we're really after is transference. It just so happens that specific exercises often have the highest transference. This is the same thing, right? What we're really after is training effect, and it just so happens that general principles often apply to individuals very, very well when it comes to eliciting those training effects.
That takes us in an interesting direction, but I'm kind of curious to know what you think about this. First of all, I'm totally in agreement as far as the general principles go. Now, it's not uncommon to find these general principles articulated and even listed out in some cases, right? And I'm not against that fundamentally or anything, but I can't help but wonder how useful that is. So let's say that we have, can you take somebody that knows basically nothing about training and say, here are your general principles, principle of overload, principle of specificity, principle of fatigue management, so on, so on, so on. Now, write a training program. I don't know how effective that's going to be versus a more, I don't even know what you would call it, but I don't know, something like tactile even, so a more pragmatic approach. And then the principles inform that and maybe can kind of become your bullshit detector or something. But, they're there, but how useful do you think it is to have them articulated?
Yeah. I mean, I think in the situation that you are describing, not particularly useful, but I also don't think that's the situation that's typically arising, right? I don't think what's happening most of the time is people with zero training experience at all are picking up a book or an article or whatever that articulates principles of training and saying, oh, I've never done this before, but I'm ready to write a program for myself. Like, yeah, I agree that would be a little ridiculous, but I don't think that's happening. Or if it is, it's, yeah. So like, so then the question becomes, if we agree that's not happening, then the question becomes, is it useful to have these principles articulated in general, maybe for more experienced people? I think it definitely is. I think it's really useful because they are really, really important descriptive principles that guide the way we write programs, and maybe more importantly, that sort of inform our understanding of the training process as a whole, so that when, you know, the oft-heard expression, you've got to know the rules before you can break them.
Yeah.
And I think what you find is that when you have a particularly, or rather a sufficiently nuanced understanding of the quote-unquote rules, you find that even when you break the rules, you're really just bending them. And you can usually find ways that they do happen to kind of fit with these general principles. Because, like, it is true that, let's say, progressive overload, for example, you're not going to improve over time without progressive overload. That's just true. But it might be the case that progressive overload looks pretty different athlete to athlete. Ages in training age, biological age, height, weight, injury, whatever. So it might be that you have to progressively overload in a much slower manner, or even in a much more convoluted manner. It might be that you have to progressively overload in a way that's harder to measure by incorporating, more variety into your training, or whatever it happens to be. But I think that it's very, very helpful for people with some training experience to have a clear and articulate understanding of these principles, because that is the only case in which they can really deviate from those principles in a way that is systematic and thoughtful, rather than just essentially saying, what I'm doing isn't working, let's take some shots in the dark.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. So we've kind of hit around specificity and transfer in a lot of different ways. Is there a way that you could think of that you would want to study it? Like, I think that's probably one of the biggest complaints that I've come across is that, how would you know? How would you know that, say, a pin squat is going to lead to a better squat performance than just having done more competition squatting? So if you wanted to investigate that a bit more clearly, how would you know? Because we've already said that there's a lot of inter-individual variance here, and pin squat is going to be worse for some people, and I think it would be better for others. And since there's a multitude of potential exercises that could be better for a given athlete, it's never going to pan out in the averages. Like I said, if you had two cohorts and you ran them on one program that was specific and the other contained, say, assistance work, it's never going to pan out. So how would we look at this and say, hey, that's a way that we could measure it and see.
Are you asking me a epistemological question, which how would you know? Or are you asking me more like a practical sort of, well, if you're writing the program and you want to make sure that you are setting up the program in such a way that you can leverage the information usefully? Well, what exactly is the question here?
I mean, take it wherever you like. I know that your brain tends to work more epistemologically, so if you'd like to go there, that's fine with me.
Yeah, I mean, this is really tough, right? I think that from this sort of epistemological perspective, the answer is probably something like, the more that your programming is responsive to the athlete's state on any given day, the more likely the day-to-day and week-to-week feedback is to be, for lack of a better term, accurate, or maybe relevant is a better way to put that. So if I write a program that talks about kind of this bottoms-up way of writing programming, where rather than, okay, well, your 1 rep max back squat is 500 pounds, and we want to have you working with 80% of 500 pounds for your regular squats. So we're going to have you working with 65 or 70% in pin squats. Rather than doing it like that, I think that just by virtue of sort of setting up the program in such a way that allows the athlete to train with the weights that are appropriate on that day based just on the RPE you're giving them, I think that makes the information a lot more relevant. And because the information is more relevant, you can much more quickly relate it to their progress or lack of progress, right? So if I have an athlete do a 5-week mesocycle that includes pin squats, maybe 5 weeks is too short, right? Maybe we say like we have a 15-week mesocycle and the first 5 weeks included pin squats. And we noticed that when they moved into the second mesocycle and then the third mesocycle, they seemed to be objectively, they were hitting PRs on their, their regular squat for sets of 5 or whatever. And more subjectively, the athlete gave us some feedback like, wow, after those pin squats, I really feel more solid in the bottom position or coming out of the bottom, wherever. We would there have a good starting point. I think, unfortunately, there's no short answer, right? The answer is you try something, you pay close attention to the objective results and to the subjective comments from the athlete, and you kind of say, do I have good reason to think that this was contributive to their progress? And if so, you perform further testing. It is a process that is neither clean cut nor quick. But I think that's really the only way to go about it. And again, you could also say like, well, we could perform a study on pin squats, and if the study was well conducted, or if there were enough of them, or whatever qualifiers you want to throw on there, that would certainly give us some information. But it would give us, again, descriptive, generalizable information. That doesn't mean it's not useful. It's very useful. It's useful descriptively, and we still have to do the sort of legwork, no pun intended, of applying it to the particular athlete and seeing how they respond.
And I think that's one of the interesting things about this problem, right? Is that it's a problem that's not readily obvious how you would conduct a study in a sense of what's commonly carried out in exercise science studies that could prove the kind of claim that's being made here. Because basically, and I've kind of wrestled with this for a while, because if I could figure it out, I would love to do like a Project Momentum style investigation on it, to see if my inclinations are, would pan out. But so far, all the designs that I think of kind of don't really test the claim that's being made, because it's a very individual thing. Like what I would need to do is something like, find individuals who we've used an emerging strategy with, who have shown a proclivity for having good results with pin squats, and then, split those into different groups. And that's just not, even that, like, even if you could do that, it still wouldn't.
Right. It would still give you generalized information. I actually think that's fine. I think that like something like that is 100% worth pursuing. It's not that process that needs to change. We just have to understand in our sort of analysis of that information, we have to understand what we're gleaning and how to apply it and how not to apply it. The failure isn't in the sort of the scientific method. The failure is in taking this information and treating it as though it is universally true. That's not even the right term. Rather universally applicable, rather than being really helpfully informative, but like you still have to do the job of coaching the athlete. And sometimes, absolutely, you'll find athletes who you apply these general principles and, oh, hey, worked perfectly. Don't have to change anything. That absolutely does happen. But sometimes it doesn't. And that doesn't mean that the science is quote unquote wrong. It doesn't mean that investigations of this type are not useful. It just speaks to the fact that there's normal variance between individuals, physical and psychological variance. and that what a coach's job really is finding that variance and modifying our application of general principles in order to accommodate it.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of comes back to that problem of, you know, applying a general rule to a specific instance, you know, and that, like, yeah, more often than not, that's going to be fine. But you're talking about having a lot of those rules that are going to make up the training for any particular athlete. And as far as I can tell, the odds of having an athlete that fits into the average for all of those different rules is increasingly slim, right? That, yeah, they might respond to the average in terms of, say, intensity, and they might respond to the average in terms of exercise selection. But as you have more and more of these parameters included, the odds of them being average in every single one of them diminish, you know? So if you're truly interested in optimizing a training process for an individual, which that's basically our job, is you've got to figure out where do they deviate, you know, and some people are going to deviate in a bunch of areas. And like you're saying, some people really don't seem to deviate very much, you know? But man, if you do kind of fall outside of the norm, that's really important to know.
Yeah. There's also, when we talk about averages, so there's a fascinating book, one of the best books I've read in a couple of years, that really informed my thinking on a number of subjects. It's called The Normal and the Pathological. It was written, I think, in 1962 by a French philosopher and physician named Georges Canguilhem. And the book sort of focuses, although it never really makes explicit, like this is the topic of this book, what the book is sort of about is about the way that we define the idea of health. We can get off in the weeds on that. That's a huge subject for me. But more importantly, there's a whole, you know, one of the terms in there in the title is normal. And there's a whole section in the book dedicated to this concept of normal. And he talks a lot about averages. And I'm surely going to mess it up because a big chunk of it is mathematical. And I'm about as good at math as I am at marathons, which is to say, I don't do it. But he makes some really interesting observations about sort of like the way averages work and the populations we draw from, and even the way that scientists might be biased in their selection and their understanding of averages. And that's all fine and normal. It doesn't mean that we cannot use that information. Again, it just means we have to look at it through this lens of, well, look, just because we're getting these averages doesn't mean they're like we might not have sufficient data to call this a real average, or the average might actually be the average among, you know, certain groups or with certain biases or within this certain, you know, scientific paradigm, to refer back to that book that I told you to read that you never finished. But yeah, so it's very much not to say that these processes aren't useful. They're immensely useful. They are, you know, science is, I think, pretty much undoubtedly, inarguably, the most powerful tool we have for investigating the natural world. And powerlifters barely qualify as part of the natural world. That said, so it's not to say that we don't use that tool. It's just to say, like, we have to acknowledge its limits, and we have to find a way to work within those limits, because ultimately a coach's job is not to do the science. The coach's job is to develop the athlete. And where successful protocols happen to deviate from whatever scientific information we happen to have at the moment, I think you just have to kind of go for it. And you don't say, but on the flip side of this, that's not to say, well, that means the science is wrong. No, it means maybe the science is incomplete, or the science hasn't figured this out yet, or it's not equipped to answer the question that you're asking. Yeah, exactly. Right. Like there just are questions science can't answer, that the scientific process, you know, there are questions that are outside of that realm, that are outside of the empirical even. Do you want to go into that a little bit? Like, I don't know. I know that that's a little bit off of our scheduled topic, but I think that that's a really interesting and useful area. I mean, yeah, I'm happy to. Is there something particular you want me to elaborate on? Well, you kind of mentioned the book that you told me to read. And I know we've had some conversations about that, but I think that's
that's something really useful to understand, is just kind of what some of the limits of scientific inquiry might be.
Sure. So the book I was referring to is Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is kind of the founding book of like modern philosophy of science, although some people accuse him of sort of plagiarizing is a strong term, the work of Michael Polanyi in his book Personal Knowledge, which was published a few years prior. I think they both came to a conclusion that that's not what happened, but whatever. So The Structure of Scientific Revolutions is a book that investigates the way that science itself works. Kuhn started his academic career in, I want to say, physics, and then switched to philosophy and ended up doing philosophy of science. And Kuhn's sort of idea can be, and I strongly recommend anybody who's interested in this, go read the book. It's not long. Mike couldn't finish it. I don't understand why, but it's not a hard book. And honestly, you can just look up like Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is the best philosophy resource on the web, and I'm sure they have a fantastic entry on this. But anyway, so essentially what Kuhn says is that, look, the common view of how science works is it is the constant and forward-moving accumulation of facts which persistently increase our accurate understanding of the natural world. Kuhn says this is flawed. In reality, science progresses through a series of revolutions. The revolutions are what we call paradigm shifts. So actually, most people have heard the term paradigm shift. That term was actually popularized by this book. So Kuhn says something like, look, it's just impossible for science to answer all questions at the same time. There are too many questions. What scientists have to do, and I want to be clear here, Kuhn is supportive of this. He thinks this is good and right, and this is how science needs to work, is that you sort of create this series of admissible evidence and questions that you can answer, and you investigate those things. And that thing is called a paradigm. Have you ever heard the I guess I don't know if it's a joke or what, but you've heard there's a drunk guy wandering around under a streetlight looking at the ground, and somebody walks up to him and says, "What are you doing?" And the drunk says, "I'm looking for my keys." And the other guy says, "Did you drop the keys here?" And the guy says, "No, I dropped them down a block." And the guy says to the drunk, "Why are you looking here?" And the drunk says, "Well, this is where the light is." That is a really unnuanced way of sort of describing scientific paradigm. It's just the case that the nature of knowledge is such that, like, if we regarded all questions at all times as reasonable for a particular scientific field or area of inquiry, and considered all evidence to be admissible, we would just never get anything done. It would just be a purely random process. So what we do instead is we create this paradigm. And I want to be clear, paradigms are created sort of subconsciously isn't the term, but they organically, maybe they just sort of happen. And then what happens is over time, we answer questions that are admissible by the paradigm. Kuhn refers to this as normal science. And he says normal science is essentially puzzle solving. You kind of already have the answer to your question, and what you do is seek to confirm it. When you perform an experiment and the hypothesis is not held up, that experiment is actually considered a failure, right? A successful experiment is one that proves the hypothesis you already had. The way that science advances, Kuhn holds, is that as a paradigm sort of gets more and more used up, you answer more and more of the questions, you start to have more and more anomalies. And over time, you run into so many anomalies that you are forced to change the paradigm. This is a paradigm shift. And you essentially change the rules of the game, so to speak, and now you have a new direction for research. You have a new map of this scientific paradigm. And
so let me jump in here real quick. Is there a way that you could kind of crystallize this with an example? Just in case, somebody's not following exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm gonna do my best here, but I'm terrible at really recalling specifics from books. But Kuhn, one of the examples, actually, he gives a couple examples like this of like certain things. actually a lot of science being discovered accidentally. And one of the things that he talks about, he gives a whole big kind of write up about, is the discovery of oxygen. Not only was oxygen discovered accidentally, it's actually the case that several scientists prior to the guy who officially, quote unquote, discovered it, I don't remember his name, discovered it first. And what those scientists' response was to write it off as an anomaly that could not be correct because it did not fit with the scientific paradigm within which they were operating. Over time, more and more people sort of came to this discovery, and a couple of them said, no, I don't think this is an anomaly. I think our paradigm, they didn't use that term obviously, is wrong. And over time that caused this shift to this new paradigm where, like, oh, let's research this thing that we now are convinced exists, which in this case was oxygen. I would feel like I'm certainly not doing that justice. Like I said, the book's worth reading, or just I'm sure the SEP entry would be really, really solid. They're always excellent. But yeah, I think that the general way to look at it is just like, look, the limits of science are the limits of our ability to know things, our ability to deal with all the information that is coming at us at any given time. Science is a fundamentally human endeavor. It's subject to human biases. And it does not just accumulate information and become more and more accurate. Rather, it shifts around. It moves the street light so that we can look into new areas of inquiry. And certainly, as a result of this gradually shifting scientific set of scientific paradigms, our overall knowledge of the natural world absolutely does increase. That's inarguable. It's just not the case that it increases in this like super linear fashion. And I think the relevant takeaways for that are that if it is the case that the way that we do science is always limited by the questions our paradigm deems answerable and the evidence it deems admissible and the biases of the humans who are inside that paradigm, then we have to leave room for the acknowledgement that sometimes we won't be able to answer certain questions with science, or we may sometimes discover things that seem to, quote unquote, go against the science. And that's perfectly fine and okay. And it doesn't mean that the science is wrong. It just maybe means the science is not in a place right now where it is dealing with this kind of question.
Yeah. I think I can. I'm getting what you're saying, and I'm trying to think of a way to tie this back to how to lift weights better. It's like, I mean, it's connected in my head, but I think
it ties in exactly to what we're talking about, which is simply that when you analyze, like let's say you have a coach. This coach ain't me, but let's say you have a coach who's really serious about doing his or her best to really stay up to date on all the latest information that's coming out. They have access to journals, and they do a really, really good job of finding new research and trying to parse it and understand it. Let's assume they even have the training to accurately understand these studies. All that this means, it doesn't mean these studies aren't useful. It doesn't mean they're wrong. All that it means is that the lens through which we view the results of scientific research has to be colored by the understanding that sometimes not only is this particular study or the entire paradigm of exercise science as it currently is not asking some questions that may be relevant to the way we coach athletes. It might not even be capable of asking those questions. Those questions might, return a 404, so to speak. Questions wouldn't make sense. That's, again, for the millionth time, because I'm sure we're going to, people are going to hear this and be like, but science. This doesn't mean that the scientific process is not useful. It is our most useful tool. It just means we must acknowledge the limits. And once we acknowledge and understand what those limits are, we can apply scientific research much more effectively, because we don't try to apply it in this cookie cutter, like, oh, the science is universal and generalizable to everyone sort of way, which is, it simply is not.
Right. And I think it's important to acknowledge too, especially when we're talking about paradigms, that if if we knew what the current paradigm was and had a better one, then it wouldn't be the current paradigm, that.
Right. Yeah, paradigm shifts are organic. They don't happen explicitly. It's not like, okay, well, right now we're in the, we're in the paradigm of using, really studying progressive overload, but maybe we should be studying that. It doesn't work like that. That's not like paradigms are organic. And what happens is you essentially like you squeeze that lemon until the juice is gone, and you naturally sort of start running into more and more anomalies, more and more failed quote unquote experiments, and at some point they become impossible to ignore. Oftentimes, this is tied with like a new generation of scientists coming in, right? Because it's just human nature that, like, if you are 60 years old and you've been in the field since your junior year of college, since you were 20 or whatever, like, it's just going to be harder for you to recognize that the paradigm is changing, and you're going to be more prone to writing off anomalies, even when there's an overwhelming amount of them, as being truly anomalous rather than being indicative of some sort of change that is happening or needs to happen. That's exactly like I mentioned earlier with the discovery of oxygen. I don't remember the name, but one of the scientists who originally came across it in an experiment wrote it off as just like, oh, well, this was clearly a mistake. This is something else.
Yeah. Well, one thing that brings to mind is, and I'm not totally certain on where the current scientific consensus sits on this right now, but the central governor hypothesis for fatigue. At least a few years ago, when I was looking into it a bit more specifically, it seemed like the younger scientists were kind of coming up with this central governor hypothesis, and it was increasingly popular among the younger scientists. The older scientists seemed to generally reject it, but over time, and that seems somewhat like a paradigm shift. If you start with thinking, fatigue occurs in, let's take running, for example. If you run a lot, then your legs get tired. And so fatigue happens in this specific area of the body, because of, depletion of substrates or depletion of whatever, glycogen and things like that. If that's kind of your view of things, that's going to color your experimentation and things like that. However, if you start with the thought that fatigue occurs in the brain, and that it's not really due to depletion in any of the peripheral tissue, that's going to change, like you were saying, change the questions that you would even think to ask. Why didn't the older scientists do that study? Well, they didn't think to ask that. Like, it never occurred to them. How come you never had a thought that you've never had?
Yeah, it's not even that they didn't think to ask it. It is that it returned an error. It did not make sense, given the paradigm they're within. The question was nonsensical. And that's not a fault of the scientists involved in the process. It's just how it happens. Over time, we run out of questions that we can successfully answer in the paradigm. The questions we can't answer sort of pile up and up and up until they outweigh by a significant enough margin the questions we have answered or can answer, and we are sort of forced into a paradigm shift.
It kind of makes me think of the notions of illness before germ theory.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Exactly right. Like the questions about germs or about these tiny little bacteria that make us sick, prior to our understanding of germs existing at all, those questions didn't make any sense, right? It made more sense to think spirits were making you sick because if you don't know empirically germs exist and have an understanding of what they are, that doesn't sound any less silly than it's an evil spirit.
Why would you even
right?
think
It's just the way that we're limited in the questions we can ask by a lot of things, and over time we're able to ask different questions,
Right.
and we start to focus on those questions. And when we do that, other questions are necessarily sort of eliminated from the process of inquiry because they don't make sense within the paradigm. We could try to ask all questions at once, but it would probably make science a heck of a lot less efficient.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've seen the meme before. Well, how does it go? Something to the tune of like,
Aren't you a little old for memes?
I'm starting to feel old for everything. Something to the tune of like, psychology is, you know, applied neurochemistry. Neurochemistry is applied chemistry. Chemistry is applied physics, and
Oh yeah.
you know, like so on down the line. Like it's like this regression to physics is an attempt to answer all the world's questions. And I mean, yeah, I guess, you know, but I mean, this would be a much different conversation if we needed to start at the level of quarks before we could figure out anything relevant to lifting weights, right? Like it's a totally different conversation at that point, and probably not so fun. so yeah, I mean, just to say that, I mean, if we have to start by answering, you know, the most fundamental questions before we can even ask anything else, then, you know, it's going to be a while, you know?
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly what it is. Like, I think that to do science effectively, you sort of have to start with this assumption, maybe an implicit assumption that like, I can know things, truth exists, I have some degree of access to it. Because really, if you wanted to get off way to the weeds and go into like pure epistemology, oh boy, there's a really limited number of. I mean, I think therefore I am is the famous claim, and like more or less what the claim there is. Oh, the only thing I can actually know is that I exist in some form or another, and I'm capable of thought. That's it. That's the only one. I don't, you know.
Right.
Otherwise, like I don't know that I'm not to pull another classic philosophical example. I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat running a computer simulation. But it's not particularly useful, right? Yeah, I don't know for sure that any of this external world exists, but like I seem to be here, so I should probably act like it.
Right. But a lot of that, and now I'm sure this is going to sound like to most of anybody listening that, wow, we're really veering off into Never Land here. But the reason that that's important is because it's that type of thing, it's that type of issue that leads us into the issues of scientific inquiry that we were talking about, which leads us into the limitations of what science can tell us, which leads us to how are you going to apply this to how you're going to lift weights, you know? And if we assume that, hey, you really care about this, or if you're a coach, you know, you care about this for your athletes, or if you're an athlete, you care about this for yourself, then yeah, I mean, it's important. And that's kind of where it leads at the bottom of everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because my interest in philosophy started with epistemology specifically because I wanted to be better at like understanding how to apply the information I got from my athletes, the feedback and the results of their training, how I could be better at sort of parsing that and understanding what was meaningful. And then I ended up making the grave mistake of getting mostly into ethical and political theory, and now I hate everything. But I do actually think that studying this stuff has been really useful. I think I'm a much, much better coach because of it. I'm much more comfortable saying I don't know, or I'm not sure, or let's give it a shot than I used to be. And I think that has greatly impacted for the better my ability to sort of keep athletes progressing over time, because I just sort of acknowledge sometimes things feel or look weird and they don't seem to fit the rules, but like that doesn't bother me as long as it's working, as long as I have reason to think it's working.
Right. I think to some extent that's a maturity thing, but I think that you're onto something as well, as far as that being kind of a worldview almost. I can relate to how you're.
Mike, are you when I was 20 I was immature?
I know.
That seems unreasonable.
I can relate to the kind of cognitive dissonance that, you know, of what you were talking about before. And, you know, this connects with paradigm shifting as well. I know that when I had, let's go rewind clock a few years and say I've got a lifter who's training for a competition, and then we're a few weeks out from the competition, and then suddenly the results drop off, very suddenly and without any sort of explanation. Why did that happen? They don't seem to be fatigued. They don't seem like none of the classic explanations made any sense, and that's tough, because you go, man, this thing happened. I have no idea why. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to prevent it, but then as time goes on, part of it is that you get a little bit more comfortable with it. But at least in my case, I changed the framework that I was using to view these things through. And that was it. By changing that framework, I was able to come up with some different contingency solutions and some ways of dealing with that type of scenario. And it made me more comfortable. But I think the important impact there is that it made the training better for the athletes, so that type of thing happens less. And if it does happen, we know what to do, and so it's just a better scenario overall. But that's kind of, if we need to connect it to paradigm shifting, I think that's kind of an example of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's certainly, like, so much of this really is about the concepts of like right and wrong. Here, obviously, like, I should say correct and incorrect to be more clear, are of limited usefulness. Like, sometimes things are just correct or incorrect, but beyond, the level of fundamentals, I think that things get a lot more fuzzy, and the best thing we can do for ourselves as coaches is to learn how to develop sort of a sufficiently broad and nuanced framework that we can use that information in the most productive way. And that has less to do, I think, with the information itself. Like, obviously, there's sometimes just incorrect information, but I think for the most part, there certainly are people out there who just can't even get the most basic understanding of like where things are correct and incorrect. But for the most part, like, those people aren't listening to this podcast probably. If they started, they've certainly shut it off by now.
Yeah, for sure.
But so I think really what it's about is how it's not about the information. It's about having a really nuanced and effective way of parsing and applying that information. So
let's kind of bring this back to some more practical types of scenarios. So we've touched on a couple things, and you mentioned that your initial interest in epistemology was so that you could basically be a better coach and better apply, better understand the things that you thought were true, and have a better knowledge of what you know and what it means to say, I know X.
Sure.
Something like that, right? So what has changed in your process since then? And maybe a better question, or a more straightforward question, is, what is your process like nowadays?
Sure. So when writing programs for individual athletes, the biggest change is that it's very rare that I write more than 1 week at a time, right? Like, usually if I write 2 weeks at a time, it's because, oh God, I've got a bunch of travel next week and I have to get ahead on my programming. But I strongly prefer not doing that, where I used to write 4, 8, 12 weeks of programming at a time. And the reason that I don't do that anymore is that, one, I always have a basic structure in mind. I don't really need to write that structure down, so I always know what the structure is. So two, why?
When you say have the basic structure in mind, you're talking about kind of more of a long-term plan.
Sure, right. So I know that during this, I know that this training block is probably going to be 12 to 16 weeks, depending on the athlete's results. Obviously, if we're prepping for a competition, that's a little different. It's a little harder. But I know that, for example, look, we're going to progress from like sets of 10 in the squat to sets of 8 to sets of 5 to sets of 1 to 3.
Sure.
I know that we squat on Tuesdays. I know that we do snatches and muscle ups on Mondays, or whatever it happens to be. So I always have that general structure in mind. So given that I don't really need to write out like this just very basic structure, I usually write like a skeleton, so that I basically just a note of reminders that's like, we're squatting today, don't forget. But beyond that, what possible reason could there be for writing the program out 12 weeks in advance when time is linear. I have no idea what the athlete will look like 12 weeks from now.
Well, I think it goes beyond that as well, that there's some definite negative effects to doing that.
Yeah, I completely agree, because it obviates your ability to respond to the athlete's response, right?
Well, and so one thing that, I've thought and that I know a lot of coaches think is that I'll write it out, and then if it needs to be changed, I'll change it. And I'm blanking on the name of the, cognitive fallacy is the wrong word. We've been talking for a long time. My brain's failing me. But there's a limitation to the way that people think. And if you have a plan, it's harder to deviate from that plan than it is to make adjustments. The more time you spend on planning, the harder it is to change the plan cognitively.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and not even just cognitively, but just from a practical perspective, like, humans are lazy, man. And it's really easy to be like, look, if there's no program written for next week, you better believe I'm going to sit down and write the program. If there's a program written, it's really easy to be like, well, maybe I can make some adjustments here, but it seems fine.
Right.
And like, usually week to week, it would be fine. You typically need very little change week to week. But what you find is that if you make these minute week to week changes, 12 weeks down the road, the program looks pretty meaningfully different. Whereas if I write a 12-week program and I don't make those changes, it just might not be the appropriate program for the athlete at that time. So I would say the way the biggest way my process has changed is that, like, it's a lot more. I think I might have actually got this term from you. I'm not sure. It's a lot more bottoms up. So I'm managing the program from, I'm at first intaking the athlete's results and then adjusting or not adjusting the program as I see fit. Whereas I used to have a very top-down approach where, like, the program was written for weeks on end, not just the basic structure, but the details. Now, obviously, like, because part of what I do is I write custom programs, but I also write templates. Obviously, like, I have to write the templates ahead of time, or rather, I could write them 1 week at a time, but it would be very, very difficult to, if I have 40 people on a template, what would I even be doing trying to manipulate the template for 40 people's individual needs? That's not how that works.
Right. Yeah, there's not the feedback mechanism's not there in a templated program.
Exactly. But even with stuff like that, so it's things like I tend to take options in training that allow for a little bit more flexibility within the program. So, for example, the biggest and most obvious example of this is that all of our strength training is RPE or RPE driven, right? The furthest we get off of RPE is, like, rather than I used to do like 4-week cycles where typically we would do like 5 at 8 the first week, 5 at 9 the second week, 5 RM the third week, and then a deload. Now, for a template program, we'll typically do a 5-week cycle where it's like 5 at 8 the first week, 5 by 5 at, let's say, 90% of that the second week, 5 at 9 the third week, small deload the fourth week, and then RM test the fifth week. But if I'm working with a custom athlete, and this is something you and I have specifically discussed, I might just not change anything, right? If they squat a 5 at 8, I might just have them squat a 5 at 8 again the next week. And if they add 10 or 15 pounds, I'll ask them and say, hey, was this genuinely a 5 at 8? Like, it felt as hard as the week before? And if they say, yeah, I mean, maybe a tiny bit harder, but it was still a 5 at 8 or whatever, then I'm just going to keep it rolling. And then if we stagnate, then we'll make a change. I think my changes are a little less, like you and I have discussed briefly, like, you have these whole pivot blocks and stuff. I don't tend to go quite that far, partially because I'm coaching CrossFitters. So I know some of the like the stuff in the pivot blocks is, okay, we stay away from accessory stuff and all that. And, like, CrossFitters already have so much variety in their training that they already have so much less accessory work that's direct rather than coming through their sport specific work. But, like, so it might.
Yeah, it's going to look different.
Right. But the basic
I think it includes stuff like deloads anyway, right?
Sorry, say that
again. Like, you'll include deloads when that's appropriate anyway, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. For sure. I mean, I
so that's probably going to serve a similar purpose.
Totally. I suspect I actually probably deload more frequently than you do. And probably the reason for that is just that, like, my athletes, like, if my athletes are deloading their strength training, they are still training very hard. And it's relatively rare that we do it sort of all the way around deload, right? Our deloads are usually one thing, one of the many elements of their training. And the only time we really do a full deload is when we are tapering for a competition. Obviously, if I feel like an athlete just needs a volume reduction, we do that. But I don't typically think that like they need a deload so much as they just might need a little less total training volume in that case. But yeah, we definitely deload regularly. And typically when an athlete hits a plateau of some kind, we'll deload them for about a week, and then we'll change something we're doing. Typically for me, it's something like if they're making progress on a 5 at 8 for, let's say they make progress for 5 weeks and then they stagnate for 2, we'll probably deload for 1 week, and then we'll try 5 at 8 again. And sometimes they'll make progress again. And if they don't make progress, then we'll make a change. I think that kind of hand in hand with this change in my process is that my view has become so much more long-term. I'm like, I just almost don't care about next week, next month, even next competition season, right? Like, I am so focused on what is this athlete's peak potential? When are we likely to reach that? And the answer is usually a few years down the line. And I think it is not particularly productive to focus on making the athlete the best they can be now or even this season, right? Like, obviously you want to have to set up the athlete to have good results because that's going to be contributive to their sort of staying engaged in the process. But I really think the way that it is most productive to look at it is to say, how long is it likely to take this athlete to reach their best case scenario, their peak genetic potential? And then we have to figure out how to sustain that for long enough for them to kind of make an impact in their sport of choice. But as a result of that, and hand in hand with this sort of much more bottoms up view of training, I just have a very long-term view where I'm thinking like, all right, this athlete is 23 years old. They're likely to peak for CrossFit like in 3 years, maybe later if they're a woman, or I'm sorry, I should say if they're female. And having that view has really changed the way that I sort of mitigate or manage their training programs week to week and month to month and even year to year.
I think it's interesting, like you mentioned, that when you're developing training nowadays, you're writing training like 1 week at a time, and while at the same time having that larger direction in mind. And I don't know, this could just be kind of an availability bias kicking in, but as I've been looking into this more and more, it seems like the coaches who are coaching at a very, very high level in a variety of different sports are conducting training in a similar way. They're writing training. They're looking 1 week, 2 weeks, basically the minimum amount of time that makes sense. That's how far into the future they're going. And
yeah, I mean, I know coaches, for the record, I know and very good ones at that, who write programming day by day.
Wow. So
yeah. They're usually working with a very small number of athletes.
Yeah.
But and I'm thinking right now of one coach in particular I know who has coached multiple time games athletes, right? So like qualifying for the CrossFit Games is very hard. Qualifying for the CrossFit Games multiple times is really, really hard. And this particular coach has only works with a few athletes, and the way that they write the program is day to day. Obviously, they have a larger direction in mind, but each day they write the program for that day after having kind of talked with the athlete and seeing how they feel, and maybe even after they've finished their warm-up and have an idea of how they're feeling. And that's obviously a different planet. If you're working with the athlete, if you're working with 3 or 4 people, that's totally tenable, but it's exactly what you said. It's the smallest unit that makes sense. If I was working with such a small group of athletes, I would probably do that. And in fact, I have a few athletes for whom I kind of do write it day by day, in particular when we're coming off an injury or some kind of setback. The process is usually something like,
right,
here's your training for Monday. Let's talk Tuesday morning. And then if everything feels good, I'm just going to give you the training that I kind of had planned in my head, but I might make changes. I don't think that, there might be I think that having too small a unit by which to determine, like, in a unit of time, right? Whether it's a month, a week, a day, an hour, I think that's mostly limited. Like, something becomes too small when it becomes impossible for the program designer to keep in their head all of the various things that the athlete needs to do. If you had a theoretical person with an eidetic memory who never forgets anything, who always knows exactly what the athlete has done in the last week and what they need to get done this week and what they've done so far this week, I don't think there would be anything bad about just like coming in, warming up, saying, okay, here's the first thing we're doing. How do you feel? Okay, let's do this next. How do you feel? Okay, let's do this next. How do you feel? I think that the limit is not that like there's something bad about that, but rather that for the vast majority of us, we are bound to lose the thread because there's just too much information to try to hold on to.
Yeah, and there are some kind of biases in effect there that you're going to tend to overvalue the emotions of the moment. At least that's been my experience, you know. And I think that's kind of one of the problems of the whole. So when I was in my early development as a coach, you know, it was much more popular at the time to say, you know, you got to learn to listen to your body. And that's kind of where that led, is if you're hyper focused on listening to your body, then that can lead to a bit of overvaluing the emotion of the moment. And
yeah, I think that's right. That goes for coaches too. Like, for example, I'm well aware that one of my flaws as a coach is that I'm too prone to taking on the athlete's failures as my own failure and sort of rationalizing it and saying like, I'll do better next time, when the athlete really should, like, there's more they could have done, right? I'm like, essentially I'm just too, ironically, and probably not a description that most people would give me, but I'm too nice in that regard. I tend to sort of let the athletes, and I'm much better now because I'm aware of it, but I have a history of tending to sort of let athletes get away with doing less than they should be doing.
Maybe it's that you have a high locus of control. Do you feel like, you know, you want to feel like there's something you could have done differently? At least that's maybe I'm projecting, but that's how it is for me. It's like I feel like, you know, if it doesn't go well, there's something I could have done differently that would have made it go well. When that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely an element of that, and I mean, there's also I think an element of just like I work pretty closely with my athletes and I like them and I care about them on a personal level. And like, I hate to see them fail because I'm very fortunate to work with a lot of good people who I really like and I want to see them succeed. And I would kind of like, my default is kind of to take their failure onto myself and behave as though like it's my fault and not their fault. Or at minimum that like maybe I don't take it on as my fault, but say like, hey, we did everything we could, when really they could have done more. And certainly, just the sensation of like knowing sometimes things are just out of your hands it's unpleasant. It was really driven home last regional season, and I think this has actually helped me be better about this. When one of my athletes came into he's a games athlete, so this was his second run at the games, and he was pretty well favored. He came in by far in the best shape of his life. I mean, he was ready to crush it. First event was an event that historically would have been quite weak for him. It had a movement he was not good at, and he did it in. He took sixth in his region, which is very, very good. Sixth place is a very good placement. And then the second event, he got absolutely screwed over by a terrible judge. That event, he took 44th, which was dead last, through no fault of his own. He should have been, realistically, given his training scores and given the average percentage by which he tends to improve his scores in competition, which is right around 8 to 10%. He should have been right around like 7th in that event, which would have put him in the games, right? He ended up taking 6th place anyway, so 1 spot out despite that. And that really drove home like all these different things. The judge was terrible. Then it just so happened that he was in the biggest region. The region he's in has the most people. So where most regions have a bottom placement of 40, which comes with so many, however many points, his region had a bottom of 44, which means that you could get even less points for a bad placement theoretically, et cetera, and all these things. And it kind of forced me to realize like, yeah, this is a shitty day. This is a failure. But like, there's nothing me or him could have done about this. This was just, yeah. And that sort of forced me to recognize the situations where like, this is not on me. And as a result, be more vocal about telling my athletes, look, you need to get this in check. And I've done a lot more of that this season in particular, like telling athletes, look, you don't eat well and you need to get it together or you're going to fail. And, you know, stuff like that, where in the past I would have been a lot more like reticent to kind of just call them out like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. Anything else that you want to touch on before? I know I've kind of kept you for a long time. You said in the beginning here, I think before we started rolling, that you would bet that we go for 2 hours, and it seems like we're going to be right around that. But anything else process-wise you want to touch on?
I mean, we've never had. Say again?
No, you go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say we've never, you and I have never had any kind of discussion that didn't go 2+ hours. I'm surprised we haven't delved off into totally non training related issues. Quite frankly, that might be a new record. I think we've covered a lot of the sort of subjects that are you know, most in my purview. I don't know that people are going to be. I don't know who's going to stick around to listen to me rant about epistemology of training too much, but
I know. Like I'm interested to see what the reception here is going to be, because it's something that I think is very interesting. So I'm hoping that other people agree, but you never know.
Yeah, it's something I love discussing. It's really fun for me because I genuinely love philosophy. It's something I take very seriously. Like I said, my sort of main interests personally are ethical and political theory, but I'm really making an effort to do as much epistemology and philosophy of science as I can, because I want to do work on kind of filling that gap. There's not much work. There is some work. There's not much work in philosophy on things like health and sport and exercise and training. And I think there are really interesting questions. In particular, there are really, really interesting ethical questions about sports that are really hard to answer, and I'm very interested in those. And obviously, just like as a coach and as somebody who works with coaches and you know, who at some point, like one of the directions I think I want my career to go is to work on developing coaches and doing stuff like that. It's a really interesting subject. I think it's underdeveloped and underexplored, and it's definitely something that, you know, if there's an interest, I'm happy to come back and talk about it more and stuff like that. It's something I really love doing. So yeah, hopefully there's a good reception and we can do this again. I mean, we're going to do it again. I guess it's just a question of whether or not we record it, right?
Exactly right. So you mentioned some of the stuff being kind of a growing interest for you and a place where you spend a lot of time thinking. And I know that you've written about it, probably not as much as you would like, but
story of my life.
Yeah, no, but it's more than what's out there currently, right? So would you mind sharing where we could go to find out more and that sort of thing?
Sure, yeah. So I guess there's 2 places where you can find me. My main website and my business is tzstrength.com. That's just going to be a bunch of stuff about what I do, which is primarily coaching CrossFit athletes. I write programming for CrossFitters and for affiliates. So, you know, for gyms who want to outsource their programming and stuff like that. But then the website where you can find my thoughts about this kind of stuff that we've been discussing is exercisephilosophy.com. Both words spelled the normal way. It is,
you're so unconventional.
I know. I shouldn't have put an E at the beginning of exercise. Maybe a Z in there somewhere. I don't know. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't thinking clearly, which is ironic.
Random capital letters and stuff like that.
Ironic for philosophy that I wasn't thinking clearly enough. But yeah, it's exercisephilosophy.com. There's, I don't know, maybe like 6 or 7 articles on there. They're all like, you know, for the most part, fairly in depth, and they range from like, I think the very first article on there is about sort of ethical risk in exercise, stuff like that. There's an article there's a whole article called Epistemological Ease in Training, which covers a lot of the stuff that we discussed today. There's stuff on like the meaning and the purpose of sport and all that. So yeah, hopefully some interesting stuff there. And yeah, I'd be happy to discuss further if there's interest.
Yeah, I think that would be really cool. Not every podcast that we do elicits good conversation. So, you know, I've certainly enjoyed this, and hopefully everyone else does too. And maybe we can get some conversation continuing online or something like that, if we can pull that together, I'll make sure to let you know. But thanks very much for your time, and thanks for having the conversation with me. It's something that I really enjoyed. So we'll make sure to talk to you again soon.
That sounds good. Thanks for having me on.
Reactive Training Systems.